In this lecture, we'll be talking a little bit about the appearance of Israel in the land of Canaan. We'll be looking at the book of Joshua, particularly the first 11 chapters, but also be looking at the second half of the book as well. We'll also be dealing with some of the archaeological information that's relevant to the early chapters of Joshua, and be talking some about the idea of holy war. So let's begin by talking about how this period of conquest and settlement of Canaan was a period of transition for Israel. There were a lot of transitions that you might think of for this nation as they're emerging out of being in the status of slaves to having freedom, having their own land, their own country, their own livelihoods. And if you're aware with some of the difficulties that people have transitioning out of prison or transitioning out of situations similar to this, you can kind of feel for the difficulty that the Israelites went through. Also, it's a time of transition from tribal identity to national identity. They will have these 12 tribes for a couple hundred years, according to the biblical narrative, and they will eventually be transitioning toward a national identity, national government, and we'll see some of the strengths and weaknesses of that as time goes along in the Bible story. And then at the same time, there's a transition from divine kingship, where there is no human king, to the fact that the people begin to look at the nations around them and they see that other nations have kings and kingdoms, and they begin to long for the kind of government that is similar to that among other nations. And then the transition from a semi-nomadic life, where they move from place to place and they pastured flocks, agricultural or pastoral in nature, to being landed and to having communities of their own and dealing internationally with other nations. And then the transition from very simple worship to, over time, a highly complex cult that is centered around a particular place in this land of Canaan where they end up. And in particular, that particular place is the city of Jerusalem. So these transitions begin in this period, but they continue to go throughout the history of Israel's existence. You can also see this as a time of consolidation as these particular tribal groups begin to occupy this land, and as the land is divided among the 12 tribes, and as they settle into their new lifestyles, they begin to consolidate some of the territory around them that once belonged to other groups. They have both this tribal and national identity and tribal and national leadership, as that leadership solidifies and kind of helps this nation as it begins to as they begin to come their own people. And then a national purpose, and initially the national purpose is just to carve out a place for themselves in the land of Canaan. And so it's a time of transition, a time of consolidation, and finally it's a time of assessment where Israel must ask themselves the hard questions about who they're going to be in this new land. Will they worship Yahweh exclusively, or are they going to dabble with the gods of Canaan? And how will they relate to neighboring nations around them? So these three issues kind of set a backdrop for the rest of our discussion in this lecture. I guess you could say the theological key to this book is the idea that God is going to fight for Israel. Chapter 21, verse 43, this is God's battle. This is not Israel's battle. And the way that Israel relates to God in this relationship is that this land was given to them and promised to them by God to their ancestors generations ago, beginning with Abraham and also continuing on to Isaac and to Jacob, and how these essential elements of God's promise included land, descendants, blessing, and a name, all four of those aspects. And so the issue of the land, as far as Israel was concerned, was a conditional relationship with God. If they kept the covenant, they kept the land. If they failed to keep the covenant, the land would always be in jeopardy. And so while this land was a gift to be given them, it was a gift to be taken, not just simply received. They had to go out and find a place for themselves in this land of Canaan, much like Abraham had done generations earlier. In fact, you find some very different models between the model that Abraham used and the model that is taught in the book of Joshua, and we'll kind of see how that develops as this lecture continues. Just a few things in terms of highlights from the first half of this book, the first 11 chapters. You have, in chapter 1, you have some initial promises to Joshua, who has now taken over for Moses, and God promises Joshua that he will be with them throughout this whole journey. You have Joshua sending out the 2 spies that stay at Rahab the prostitute's house, and they are aware of what's going on there in the city of Jericho, and Rahab has heard about Israel, who's already made kind of a name for themselves. They cross the Jordan in miraculous fashion, and right prior to their battle there at Jericho, they circumcise all the males. Remember, this new generation that emerged in the wilderness the males had not been circumcised yet. So you have this very odd timing where they cross the Jordan River right in the very front of this formidable city of Jericho. And what's the first thing they do? They renew the covenant, they circumcise all their males, and you can imagine quite a step of faith to have your entire army be laid up like that for a time to recover. Again, the point being that this is God's battle, not the army's battle or the nation of Israel's battle. Jericho falls due to no action on the army's part. They simply march around the city, follow God's instructions, and the walls come a-tumbling down, as the song goes. One of the commands that was given to the people of Israel as they conquered Jericho was not to take any spoils, that this entire city was to be dedicated to God for destruction. And Joshua tells a story of a man named Achan that sees some things that look good to him, and so he took them and he hid them and he buried them in the floor of his tent. And because of his sin, the very next battle is a defeat, which really shocked the Israelites, because Jericho had just been given into their hands by God. But since there was this poisonous sin in the camp, then the entire nation struggles as a result. Once they find out who the source of that problem is with Achan, they deal with that issue, take care of that problem, and Achan and his family are destroyed, and then Ai itself is destroyed. By the way, archaeologists, I believe there's 2 and possibly even 3 possibilities for where Ai might be, and archaeologists are working on that as we speak each summer. And then in chapter 9, you have the story of a group of residents in the land of Canaan. God had told Israel to drive out the inhabitants of the land, otherwise they'd become problems for them down the line. The Gibeonites posed as though they were foreigners, even though they lived locally in the land. They dressed up as though they had come on a long journey, and they disguised themselves as to who their tribal identity really was. So they struck this agreement with the people of Israel that Israel would not raise a hand against them, only to find out later that these people were living right among their midst. But since they had already struck this agreement, then they were forced to live with the Gibeonites being there among them. And then the northern campaign of Hatzor and other cities where Israel goes and conquers those particular areas. So this is just kind of a brief overview of the contents of the first half of the book of Joshua. So the Bible itself, and most people don't understand this because they don't read it carefully, but the Bible presents diverse perspectives as to how Israel entered the land of Canaan. And some people read the first 11 chapters of Joshua and they don't read any further, and they certainly don't read Judges. So let's talk about these diverse perspectives that come from the pages of the Bible itself. Joshua 1 through 11, those chapters depict a blitzkrieg-like conquest in the very south and the very north of Canaan. You don't have any recorded battles in the center, the heart of the land of Canaan, but in the south and in the north. Yet at the same time, Joshua 13 to 24, and certainly the first 2 chapters of Judges, depict this process as a gradual, not a blitzkrieg-like conquest, but a gradual emergence and occupation of the land, which was largely unsuccessful and incomplete. So you kind of have both ends in the Bible, where there were a number of initial victories followed by years, decades, centuries of struggle. Kind of reminds me in the one of the Gulf Wars, where George W. Bush stood on the deck of the aircraft carrier, and right behind him was a banner that said "Mission Accomplished," yet the war went on for nearly a decade. So that's kind of the way it works in the Bible. You have some new sites that are established in the Central Hill Country in the 12th century BC, and so you have that situation where, in addition to military conquest, you have the establishment of sites that didn't exist at all prior to this time. So brand new communities that arise as Israel appears in the land. You have this, at the close of the Bronze Age, the late Bronze Age, you have kind of this perfect storm of all these things that come together that cause the collapse of virtually all the civilizations in the Mediterranean basin. Crete, Egypt goes through a downtime, Syria, the land there in Canaan, all these places, due to ecological factors, due to military factors, possibly due to climate change. Nobody really knows why, but you have these vibrant, dynamic civilizations that just kind of collapse for about 200 years. And these civilizations, which had all this international trade and produced quite beautiful pottery for the next couple hundred years, you just see kind of a dark age, I guess you might say, at the close of the late Bronze Age and the beginning of the early Iron Age. So some have suggested this is an appropriate time for a group of slaves to occupy a land that once was powerful and strong and now is going through a weak phase. So let's talk a little bit about the military campaign that is described in Joshua. There's a southern campaign and a northern campaign. Remember, I said the heart of the land in the middle is, there are no recorded battles that take place in the central area. So you have the Jericho story, a number of other cities in the south, and then them moving to the north with a couple battles, particularly the burning of the city of Hatzor. And then in chapters 12 to 22, you have the land being assigned among all the tribes. And chapter 13 sounds as though it's just all wrapped up and nice and neat and tidy, and everyone has been pushed out, and Israel moves in to occupy the land. But if you read the Bible carefully, nothing could be further from the truth. And then at the end of chapter 24, you have this covenant renewal ceremony at Shechem that we'll say about at the very close. We'll talk about at the very close of this lecture. So I've got a few slides here about archaeological evidence as it relates to the conquest. Because there are some problems with the biblical account which depicts what happens as this kind of lightning attack that they go in and they divide the land in half. They move to the south, they push through there with relative ease, they go to the north and push through there with relative ease. So people have looked for evidence archaeologically of destruction on the part of cities roughly around the time of the conquest. And so one of the problems with that is determining when the conquest was. And we have talked earlier in this class about how you have some that depict the conquest and settlement around the 1400s BC, others around 1200 BC. So archaeologists have looked for evidence that supports some kind of military conquest. Indeed, there is evidence of destruction of some cities, in particular Hatzor in the north, but also Shiloh and other places as well. Now, whether it was Israel that destroyed those cities, there's no sign out there or no indication for sure who that was, but there are clearly some kinds of evidence of destruction. And then there's also evidence that there, as I mentioned before, of numerous cities that just sprung up in the hill country between 1250 and 1100 BC. So that's part of the archaeological evidence that we have on the positive side of things. On the negative side is the evidence that we have from the city of Jericho, because Jericho is the first battle that's talked about in Joshua. It seems to be a highly fortified city, and it comes collapsing down, and Israel just kind of moves in and takes over. Indeed, the British archaeologist around the turn of the 20th century, a little later than that, John Garstang excavated there at Jericho. Indeed, he found a Bronze Age wall that had fallen about 1400 BC, and it was a double wall that had literally fallen out flat. Rather than just crumbling down, it had kind of tipped out flat, much like the story depicted in the book of Joshua. So for a period of time, everybody said, see, archaeology approves the Bible. But then later, around the middle of the 20th century, Kathleen Kenyon, another British archaeologist, said, yes, what he found is true, but his dates are off by a couple hundred years, 150 years. And what had happened there at Jericho had happened long before the Israelites ever arrived there. And her contention was that indeed no one even lived at Jericho during the time when the Bible says that this collapse of this city took place. So she says that the wall Garstang found is about 100, 150 years older. I think that's a misprint on my, that's definitely a misprint on my slide there. About 150 years older than what he had contended. Well, recently in the 1990s, Bryant Wood has gone back and done some excavation there at Jericho, and his contention is that John Garstang is right and has been right all along. But I'll just say that Bryant Wood's study has not won a wide following among archaeologists. Most archaeologists see Kenyon's work as that lasting contribution, and it's kind of holding the argument, at least to this time. However, many people do not agree with Kenyon's contention that no one lived in that site. Just because a portion of the site was destroyed does not mean nobody lived there, and does not mean that there was not anyone around that would have fought back against some kind of occupation of the land by Israel. Here's a picture of the tell there at Jericho. You can see some of the Palestinian houses around. Basically, it's looks like a mini oasis there. Here's another view of part of that ancient double-walled structure that initially surrounded this particular site. So, what about some evidence in favor of a conquest? Well, we do have evidence of a different material culture appearing that replaced a different kind of culture, not drastically different, but let me just give you a few examples. Surprisingly as it might sound, a lack of pig bones in the hill country is a big indicator of Israelite presence because, as you know, the ancient Israelites did not eat pork, whereas the ancient Canaanites loved pork, and so one of the things archaeologists look for is the presence of pig bones, and you can actually see cut marks on bones of animals that have been prepared for eating, just like you'd cut up a chicken or prepare it to eat. You can see cut marks to show that, okay, they not only had pigs, but they were actually consuming those pigs. There's also a unique architectural feature called the four-roomed house, in which you have a house that is kind of a combination barn and home all in one, where an animal or two could live downstairs in an open area where you'd have your fire and you could do your cooking, and then you'd have rooms upstairs as well as a room downstairs. And this four-roomed house is not present in Canaan prior to the 12th century, nor after the 6th century, when the Israelites themselves were were destroyed by the Babylonians. So that's something that archaeologists look for. And then, as mundane as it might seem, there was a typical kind of jar called the collared rim jar, which was a distinctive storage jar associated with the Israelite period. So again, I just want to say that the archaeological evidence is still out related to a conquest, and a lot of it depends on a person's prior views of the authority of the Bible. Those who do not have a high view of the authority of Scripture just kind of write the story off. Those who do indicate their will to believe in faith, the stories that is told, and kind of wait for archaeological evidence to prove or disprove some of these stories that are told in the book of Joshua. If there's one thing archaeology can tell us, is that proving or disproving the Bible is something that archaeology has never been able to do in any respect. And artifacts themselves don't signal ethnicity all the time. You know, a dish is a dish. So you just have to exercise caution and judgment. So my final word on this is that the actual conquest was probably quite complicated. We may never understand the whole picture of how things transpired through archaeology. But the bottom line is the Bible itself is complicated in that it depicts not just one single thing going on, but it depicts both successes and failures along the way. Here's an example of this Israelite four-room house. One on the left there is the structure as it's been excavated. You can see kind of that open courtyard in the middle here. I'll use my cursor to kind of show that to you. And then you can kind of see the rooms on the sides. What you can't see here is the second story, which is normally made of wood. But you can see that here in this area where you have your doorway, your open area for your animals and cooking, and then the places where people lived, and then the rooftops where often people would do a number of their daily kinds of chores and daily responsibilities on the roof of their home. Next big question, other than what archaeology has to say about all this, is what about this idea of holy war? How is it that God can sanction the complete extermination of cities, men, women, children, animals? And how does that match up for Christians in a New Testament worldview? Because for Christianity, the Old Testament is also sacred scripture. So how does one handle this tension between Old Testament and New Testament? Well, the first thing that we need to take into consideration is that the judgment that is depicted against these nations, where Israel pushes them out and where Israel is commanded to exterminate complete cities, is seen as God's judgment on the evil of those nations. And I'd really like you to take the time after this presentation is over to look at these passages in Genesis, Deuteronomy, and Kings, and you will see that these nations are a thorn in the side of Israel because their morals are a challenge to Israel. And so the judgment against these nations is seen as a judgment against an evil people. Much like today, people would want some kind of justice or judgment against a group like ISIS, for example. This is the same kind of situation you have in the Old Testament. So the idea is a lesser of two evils. You deal with the entire population now and you force them all out, rather than have battles and problems and threats to religious fidelity for generations. And I hate to put it so crassly as a cost-benefit analysis. I don't know what the military term is when military folks try and figure out what it's going to cost them in terms of human life in order to be victorious in battle. But it's the same. Many of you would know what that term is, and many of you have experience in that very thing. But it's the same thing here, where it's the lesser of two evils. You deal with the entire population now rather than struggle with this for centuries. Third thing we need to realize is that God later allows other nations to destroy his own people for the same reason. So at least you could say there's a consistency there in the Old Testament, that land possession is linked to fidelity to covenant. You don't keep the covenant, you're in danger of losing the land. And then what many people completely ignore in this whole argument about holy war is that this model in Joshua is not the model that was given to Abraham. Abraham didn't go out killing people and exterminating cities and pushing people out. Abraham settled peacefully among the people. He built his altars and he carved out a place for himself. He lived among non-believing populations. So it's not so simple as to say that the Old Testament model is drive all the unbelievers, the infidel, out so that God's believing people can live there, because that's not the model that was given to Abraham. Clearly in the New Testament, holy war is an ethic that is opposed. Jesus clearly says, if your enemy strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. So this idea of, when Peter comes to defend Jesus with a sword, he's rebuked by Jesus rather than affirmed by Jesus. So the New Testament ethic is clearly a different ethic. And for most Christians, even though the Old Testament is part of sacred Scripture, New Covenant trumps Old Covenant in terms of ethical and moral lifestyle. So I think you can just say that God works within the limits of people's understanding. And at that day and age, people saw the dominant nation as having the dominant God. And If the Assyrians destroyed the Egyptians, then it meant that the gods of the Assyrians were stronger than the gods of the Egyptians. Today we wouldn't look at it that way, but in that day and age, that was kind of the limit, the way that people understood things. And then finally, most battles, even in Joshua and Judges, are not harem battles. And the word harem in Hebrew means ban or devoted or dedicated to destruction. So Jericho was a city that was devoted to destruction. But not every city did God command, saying, kill everything that breathes in this city. Don't take any of the spoils. Don't take anything. Destroy everything. As you know, most occupying armies, if they did that, it wouldn't make any sense at all, because the very things that they're trying to gain from the possessions of other people would then be destroyed. Another pertinent issue for our class, not just for this period, but for other periods as well, is this issue of who the Canaanites were and Canaanite religion in particular. The Canaanites, it was not a country with a king. The Canaanites were these loosely organized city-states. It was a group of Semitic peoples. In other words, they shared a similar language to the Israelites. Like, for example, Arabic is a Semitic language. Hebrew is a Semitic language today. And so back in the ancient days, you have ancient Syria, which used a Semitic language. You have there in Palestine, you see a number of Semitic cultures there. So the Canaanites were an urban, primarily urban culture living in city-states, with each state having its own autonomous structure. And there wasn't a single culture called the Canaanites. The Bible talks about Amorites living there, Perizzites, Hivites, Jebusites, all these different groups. So it wasn't as simple as being a single ethnic group that lived there in the land. But one thing that was similar to the Canaanites that lived in the land there of Canaan was their worship. Canaanite religion was primarily a nature religion. In other words, if your whole livelihood is dependent on how your animals produce new animals and how your fields produce new crops and how you get laborers by having children to help you with your work, then fertility and nature religion is a vibrant part of Canaanite religion. So Baal was chief among the gods. There, he wasn't the senior god, El was, but he was chief in the hearts of people because Baal, symbolized by the bull, was a symbol of fertility, and people knew if they prayed to Baal, then their crops would reproduce, and their animals would reproduce, and their families would reproduce, and life would be good for them. It was a convenient religion in the sense that people worshipped at the tops of hills. You didn't have to go very far to worship. The idea of that worship was near and dear to your own heart in terms of your own livelihood. So Canaanite religion really became a snare for Israel. For several hundred years, Israel moved into the land, and remember we talked about this being a time of assessment where they had to assess, were they going to worship the Lord exclusively, or were they going to dabble with the gods and goddesses of Canaan? Well, they were just kind of sucked right into this Canaanite kind of worship. Canaanite worship had a very dark side to it, and that's another thing to keep in mind when we talked about that last issue about holy war. It involved what is called sympathetic magic, where, like voodoo today, a person enacts what they want to happen. They personally live out what they would like to see happen. And so you would have sacred priests and sacred prostitutes who would work at these shrines, and in order to ensure fertility in a family, a man or a woman would have sex with the sacred prostitute or the sacred priest, or a person's virgin daughter would be taken to the sacred priest who would have sexual relationships with her to ensure that her family would be fertile. So this combining of sex and religion and the livelihood of the fertility of one's family and flocks and farms was a big snare to Israel. This particular Baal symbol depicts him. Some depict Baal as a bull. Here he's depicted as a warrior with the spear is not there now, but with a spear in his hand, a thunderbolt in his hand. He was also considered to be the weather god. As you know, for farmers, weather is their worst enemy or best friend, depending on how things go. Well, then in chapters 12 to 25, you have the land that is distributed among the 12 tribes, and at the very end of Joshua, you have this covenant renewal. And it's kind of interesting in that this renewal takes place at Shechem, and that's where it all began. If you remember in Genesis 12, when God tells Abraham to leave his father's country and to go to a place that he will be shown where to go, his first place that he ends up there in Canaan is Shechem, and that's where Abraham builds his first altar to the Lord. So, many years later, centuries later, Israel comes back after living as slaves in Egypt. They divide the land that God has given them among their 12 tribes. And then they meet there at Shechem for covenant renewal. And Joshua says to the people, choose today who you'll serve, Yahweh or the gods of the Canaanites. And famous last words, I guess you might say, the people unequivocally said, we will serve the Lord. And that's the way the book of Joshua ends, with this commitment of this generation to serve the Lord. I'm going to continue this recording because I have just a 2-minute video clip that I'd like to show you that talks a little bit about Hatzor, and this is just a 2-minute clip by Ann Killebrew. So in order to do this, I'm going to turn down my microphone so that you hear her only.
In the book of Joshua 11, the account of a devastation of Hatzor is actually, there does seem to be evidence at the archaeological site of Hatzor for a massive devastation. What's important to note is in the book of Joshua, Hatzor is the only city that's mentioned as being burnt by Joshua. And in fact, in the 200-acre tell of Hatzor, which is the largest archaeological site in Israel today, the tell is the largest tell in Israel today, everywhere archaeologists have excavated, they've found a massive destruction sometime towards the end of the late Bronze Age, maybe in the mid-13th century. The debate about the date is not settled. Now, who destroyed Hatzor, of course, is the $64,000 question. It certainly could be Joshua, but it could be the Egyptians, it could be the Sea Peoples or Philistines. It could also be another Canaanite rival, because we know from the Amarna letters that during this period of time, there was constant conflict between these various
Okay, so that ends this particular lecture.
So there's a lot of possibilities.
I'll close this out now as we've taken just a little bit of look at some of the high points of the book of Joshua.